This is a presentation by Christian Perring on ancient Indian philosophy, and we'll be looking especially at the roots of Hinduism and Buddhism. So, as with other ancient civilizations, there was a strong emphasis in the culture on their local gods, and often people said that the gods were manipulating humans and causing events. So that was often an explanation for why things happened. But there was a move from that to having a better explanation, maybe more based on the kind of fundamentals and less just stuff which seemed like made up stories. So we're going to see this pattern in the Vedas and then the Upanishads. The Vedas were composed over many centuries. They were kind of sacred texts composed in Sanskrit, and there were all sorts of different documents in there. Uh, so hymns, poems, guides to rituals, and also philosophical treatises. Certainly, when we think about Hinduism, we think of it as a polytheistic religion with all sorts of gods. And we're going to look at some of their gods now. Here are three gods. There's Indra, the warrior god, Agni, the god of fire, also a key to rituals, and then Surya, who's one of the elemental gods. And other well-known gods are Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And they're known as the Trimurti, or God in three forms. So one idea here is that there's different forms of a god, but there's maybe just one god and then three different versions of that. And that kind of idea gets extended as we move along. So the Upanishads start to kind of take the ideas of the Vedas, but move them forward. In the Greek tradition, the pre-Socratics sort of reacted against the myths of the old gods. But in this tradition, there's more of like a sort of moving on and adapting ideas. Certainly, there was a shift in emphasis from talking about the external rituals to more internal philosophical reflection. There's also an idea that uh, rather than there being many gods, there's a single underlying reality which explains everything. So that takes us to the idea of the one and the many, and certainly the Upanishads move towards monotheism. Whether they actually just completely adopt monotheism and monism, uh, certainly there are strong elements of that. So there's this idea, there's a single substance or principle which underlies everything. Here's a quotation from the Rig Veda. There is one reality, but the sages call it by various names. That kind of indicates that sort of idea. So the ultimate reality is Brahman, and that's the core metaphysical concept in the Upanishads. So the Brahman is a single underlying reality, and it's unchanging. And so it's a kind of universal consciousness. So to call it a god may be not quite how we think of gods, but it's a force or a power or some kind of entity And everything in the universe is a manifestation of this underlying entity, Brahman. Here's a quotation, that which is not expressed by speech, but by which speech is expressed, know that alone to be Brahman and not what people worship. So that idea is that people worship the different gods, but really there's the underlying reality of the Brahman, but also there's this idea that it's impossible to fully express the nature of Brahman with words. So that's this idea of ineffability. It can't be understood in human terms. So it's definitely not a personal God. Uh, and we haven't got quite words for it. I mean, we can call it a principle, but uh, that doesn't sound quite what we regularly mean by a principle. It's kind of some kind of entity or force. It's the essence of everything, both the seen and the unseen. Often the best we can do is describe it in negative terms. Not this, not that. One thing to note about this sort of view is that uh, it's not saying that there's one God that created the world. Rather, it's saying the world is just one entity. And this quotation says, just as a spider spins out and withdraws its thread, just as from the earth grow plants and herbs, just as from a living person hair grows on the head and body, so from the imperishable comes forth this universe. So it's basically all part of the same thing. It's not separate from the universe. So that's the idea of Brahman. And then now we move on to the idea of self or Atman. So Atman is the individual self or soul. And we in the West are familiar with that kind of idea. It's the idea of what a person's essence, or something like that. And certainly in a lot of religious traditions, there's a claim that it's not a physical thing, it's not the brain, rather it is some kind of non-material entity connected with the body. And this seems to be a similar idea in the Hindu tradition. The Atman is an immaterial, eternal, conscious perceiver. So we see that here we have a quotation which then complicates things. That which is the finest essence, this whole world has that as itself. That is the truth, that is the self. So we're starting to get this idea that yourself, your soul, is actually part of ultimate reality, part of Brahman. Now, this is not necessarily an idea which is all through the Upanishads, but certainly it's one that's strongly suggested. So this idea that the true self is not something we can directly experience. We don't know its true nature. All we experience is our empirical self. And so we know what our body's like and our memory and personalities, our sense of self. But the idea of the philosophy in the Upanishads is to try and get us to understand our true self. And that's not going to be easy. The self is subtler than the subtlest, greater than the greatest. It's hidden in the heart of all beings. That's from the Katha Upanishad. So the idea we're seeing here is that the Atman, the individual self, is identical to Brahman, ultimate reality. Now that is especially confusing because there are many people in the world, and we think we're all separate. But if we are all identical to the same ultimate reality, then we are also all the same. There is not really any differentiation between different people. And so we're all just part of the same thing, but we're not just part of the same thing, we are actually all the same thing. So that seems to suggest that the whole idea of people being different is actually a mistake. This is known as the Great Equation, Tat Svam Asi. And this is the realization that we should try to come to understand, where everything is interconnected. In fact, maybe it's not just interconnected, but actually we're all identical. And one of the big claims here is that the realization of this great truth will also have an effect on our ability to cope with life, and it will lead to having less fear and less hatred. Now, a lot of this is connected with the ideas of reincarnation, the cycle of existence called samsara. And this is a continuous cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And for each individual, that individual has existed forever, and that the soul keeps on being reborn after their body dies. Now, you don't remember your past lives, and then once you die and you're reborn, the future version of you will not remember this life. But nevertheless, there is one soul continuing to die and be reborn. Now, how you're reborn is subject to the effect of karma, the law of cause and effect. And every thought, word, and deed creates a corresponding karmic effect. So how you live now will have an effect on how you are when you are reborn in your future life, and your previous actions led you to be reborn in this life. So karma completely determines your journey through the different selves. So this karma is really the main force which drives the cycle of samsara. Here's a quotation from the Bhagavad Gita. As a person wears new garments, discarding old ones, so the soul accepts new material bodies, giving up the old and useless ones. Now, the ultimate goal is for people is not to go to heaven, but rather it is to just end this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And the claim is that there's the metaphysical realization of the identity of Atman and Brahman will lead you to stop going through this cycle. This goal is known as moksha. So we've seen so far these in this quick run through the main ideas in the Upanishads. You have the Brahman, the Atman, the Samsara, Karma, and Moksha. Next up is Buddhism. And Buddhism is an Indian religion, and it started in India with the teachings of the Buddha, who was Siddhartha Gautama. So it's both a philosophy, but it's also a sort of practical path at trying to reduce all suffering. Uh, and there's some overlap with the ideas of the Upanishads, but there's also a major rejection of some of the major assumptions in the Upanishads. The Buddha, we don't really know exactly when he lived, but around 400 to 500 BCE, he was born in a wealthy family, or he was a royal family of some kind, and he renounced his royal life in order to pursue spirituality. The writings of the Buddha uh, were not written by the Buddha. Rather, they were written by other people and sometime after the Buddha had died. So there's all sorts of different writings, uh, but it seems like a lot of them were not just a few years, but in fact a few centuries after the Buddha existed. So that leads us, I mean, so certainly it was mostly an oral tradition, and then his writings got written down. So to what extent the writings of the Buddha that we have actually correspond to what he originally said is not something that we can be very sure about. But we certainly have kind of the main thread of his ideas, and to a large extent, he certainly rejected the idea that we should just accept what the Vedas and the Upanishads said, and he rejected at least some of their central ideas. So he rejected the idea of a permanent, unchanging self, the soul, and he also rejected the idea of Brahman. He was not claiming any sort of divine revelation. Rather, he said it was based on his own reasoning and experience. So he came up with the Four Noble Truths, and they all rest around the idea of suffering. So he says suffering exists, and that's caused by attachment and craving, which can then be ended. And the way to do that is to follow the path of the end to suffering. Suffering is not just a physical pain, it's a general dissatisfaction or unease. And it includes events like birth and illness and death and the process of aging. Uh, and it can include all sorts of things. It's the sorrow of separation from loved ones, people die or people move on. And then there are things that we want and we can't have. And all of this causes us to suffer. So here's a quotation. This is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. It is this craving which produces fresh rebirth, accompanied by pleasure and lust, finding pleasure here and there. So one thing we see is that while the Buddha rejected the metaphysical ideas of Brahman and Atman, he still believed in the cycle of samsara. And he thought this cycle is uh, perpetuated by suffering, which is still very similar to the ideas of the Hindu idea of samsara. The Buddha puts a lot of emphasis on the idea that attachment and craving is the main source of suffering. And he thinks that this comes from a false understanding of self and reality. So, like the Hindu tradition, the idea is that once you achieve enlightenment, you will escape this cycle. And so that's what we want to try and do, to really have a true understanding of self and reality. So he thinks education or knowledge is what's going to solve the problem. Ignorance is the problem. So his solution is the Noble Eightfold Path. This is how we get to escape the cycle of suffering. And this path is divided into three sections. There's wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. And we end suffering by following this path. A more technical term in Buddhism is the idea of nirvana. That's the state we achieve when we end all suffering. And that also leads to the question of to what extent is that a different view from the view of the Hindus? Well, a lot of this seems quite simple and something we can't find fault with. So he thinks you have to understand the Four Noble Truths and you need to be committed to the path. You need to not lie. You shouldn't be mean to people. You shouldn't gossip. You shouldn't harm other people. And once you live like that, you have wisdom and morality. You also need mental discipline. These are the three other parts of the path. You need right effort, which is cultivating wholesome states of mind and abandoning unwholesome ones. Obviously, we would be wondering what are wholesome and what is unwholesome, and that might be up for debate. But the Buddhist tradition is going to try to explain that to people. Then you also need to pay attention to the present moment and to your bodily feelings and your mind and reality. So there's like paying close attention to the world as it is. And you also need to have deep concentration, and that's linked to the idea of meditation. And meditation is a large part of Buddhist practice. So how do we cultivate this healthy mind? Well, there's four states to be cultivated. This tells us something about the wholesome states of mind. There's loving kindness and compassion and joy and equanimity. So if we can get to all these things, then we will start to avoid suffering. And all of this sounds rather plausible. Right? In some ways, it sounds quite similar to what people would advocate in therapy or self-help. But when you start to kind of get clearer about what nirvana is, it looks actually rather more surprising. So certainly the idea is you can avoid suffering by following the path. And there are two outcomes which might come. One is nirvana with remainder. So that is, you can, during your life, you can achieve no more suffering, and then your body, physical body, still exists. But then there's nirvana without remainder, which is a total escape from all conditions and elements of existence upon the death of the body. So that means that the cycle of rebirth has ended, but you've died. So it's not totally explicit, and there's debate about this, but it seems that on that view, nirvana is just non-existence. So the goal we should achieve through this process is to no longer exist. And that's a surprising claim. Now, the most maybe puzzling, or at least one of the most interesting parts of Buddhism from a philosophical point of view is the claim that yourself is actually an illusion, that in some significant way you don't exist. And one way that's thought of is that you're just a collection of momentary elements and you're nothing more than that. So there's the five skandhas, which is your material form, your body, then there's sensation, perception, habitual mental activity, and consciousness. And all of those are constantly changing. So there is nothing stable to make you the same person over time. Here's a quotation. Form is not self, feeling is not self, perception is not self, mental formations are not self, consciousness is not self. So that's not saying that there is no self exactly, but it's saying that all the things that people often identify with the self are actually not the self. So the ultimate view is that there is just no such thing as a permanent soul or a permanent self. There's no unitary agent. Uh, so the idea that we continue over time, that you are the same person as you were yesterday or last year or when you were born, all of that is an illusion. And once you come to see that as an illusion, then you will no longer suffer because you will stop feeling attachments to all the things. So it seems like that's going to tell us that really you're going to stop being attached to people. You're going to stop loving people, at least in any kind of possessive way. You may have a good attitude towards the other people in the world, but you will no longer feel pain when you lose people. Uh, Here's a quotation. It is a foolish person who thinks I am in the form or the form is in me, or I am separate from the form or the form is not self. The wise person sees none of these views. So this suggests that in some ways the Buddhist rejection of the self uh, is actually a kind of rejection of all metaphysical thinking and saying that we should just not think in that way. So the claim that everything is constantly changing, all things are arising and ceasing, and nothing is permanent. If you know anything about the pre-Socratics, that will remind you very much of Heraclitus and the idea that everything is always becoming. So exactly how to make sense of that is puzzling. Uh, I mean, it looks like things stay pretty much the same. If I look at my table looks the same today as it did yesterday. But there's a claim that really everything is changing. Now, my table is definitely gradually fading away, and I guess in 1,000 years it probably will no longer exist, if not before then. But so to me, it seems like it's changing very slowly. But this view seems to say, well, that no, there's nothing really permanent. And once we understand that, we will no longer be attached to it. So whatever is impermanent is suffering. What is suffering is not self. What is not self should be seen as it is with the right wisdom. This is not mine. I am not this. This is not myself. So the view that it seems to be pushing towards is the idea that we should, there's nothing really persists, therefore there makes no sense to hold on to things. Certainly that's a hard view to really take on board, but it is one that is certainly quite interesting to think about. Now, this takes us to the very puzzling question of how can we even make sense of reincarnation if the self doesn't exist? In Hinduism, it was very clear that the self kept on existing because it was an immaterial self, and it was the same immaterial self continuing to exist through each incarnation. But in Buddhism, there is no self that persists. So how can we make sense of reincarnation? And the idea is a little hard to formulate, but there's an analogy that a person is like a flame passed from one candle to another. The new flame is not the same as the old, but it is causally connected to it. So there's a kind of persistence of energy or something like that that goes on through the world, even though nothing actually remains the same. And that's what is happening in reincarnation. One person's death leads to the rebirth of another, and there's a kind of there's a causal connection there which keeps on going. So just as the flame from one lamp to another is neither the same nor different, so is the continuity of the mind stream in rebirth. It's interesting that Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher, used adopted the idea that the central element is fire, and you see here in these quotations that the idea of the self as a flame is also being promoted. So the Buddhist answer is that there is no self that is reborn, but rather a bundle of skandhas, all these different elements which we think make up the self, causally influence the formation of a new bundle. So our actions create causal connections that carry over into a new life, a new chain of skandhas.